Dear family members, have you ever wondered what it might be like to have superpowers? Or maybe just to be superhuman? Well, how about super at something? I mean world class. Well, maybe you've even wondered what it might take to get there, but you thought that might be too hard. Well, I'm here to tell you that it might not be as hard as you think. This is the power of meta-learning. Meta-learning is simply being aware of the process in which you're learning and using simple principles and methods to excel the experience. I've used meta-learning many times, from emergency medical responder to classical musician, rock musician on several different instruments, athletics, nutrition, and biohacking even. So what I'd like to do today is give you some of these tools, these methods, to excel and become world class, whether you're trying to acquire a new skill or new information. So these tools are the 7 sensory loops, an acronym that spells out DIS, we'll get there, as well as CAFE. So let's start with the most simple one, 7 sensory loops. This first method, the 7 sensory loops, is simply taking in information via one of your senses and then putting it back out there 7 times. So this could be seeing something, hearing something, feeling something, and then repeating it or writing it down or doing something with your hands. This information was first presented to me by Dr. R. Christopher Harvey, who is head of epidemiology at the CDC. He sourced this information from a huge meta-analysis published in an educational journal. In this journal, the scientists took together a bunch of different studies. They were educators, psychologists, neuroscientists, behavioral, cognitive development psychologists as well. And they found that in order to learn new and complex information, the average learner must go through 7 of these sensorimotory loops to master it. But this number could be less for the more adept learner. Adept meaning maybe that you are smarter, have more working horsepower in your brain, or it could simply mean that you're very curious and enthusiastic about what you're learning about. An example of how I use this was in the Anatomy and Physiology 2 class that I took from Dr. Harvey. He would lecture, so I'd listen to it. He would present it up on the PowerPoint, so I would see it. I would read my text, maybe look at models of the human body, and then I would go and I would write it down, tell someone I knew about what I just learned, type it out, or maybe even played with the models. So this one is probably the easiest, the 7 sensory loops. So now let's move on to a more methodical way. The acronym for this is DSSS. Diss, you can think of it like someone's dissing you, and so your rebuttal is showing off your skill set or your knowledge. And this stands for deconstruct, selection, sequence, and stakes. So let's take a look at deconstruct. What does that mean? We're separating the pieces of what you're trying to learn about into the fundamental building blocks. So for example, we'll take nutrition. So in nutrition, the building blocks might be what you're eating, when you're eating it, how much you're eating, and so on. The next letter, S, is for selection. Which 20% will produce 80% of the results? So, for this selection example would be in cooking. If you can learn to grill, saute, and braise, then you can cook most likely 80% of the dishes you like. The next S in DIS is for sequencing. Often a big roadblock for people when trying to learn something new is just in the order in which the information is presented to them. Take guitar instruction, for example. Oftentimes, new students are told to sit down and practice these scales over and over again. Well, this gets boring, and at the end of the day, you probably still can't play the songs you like to listen to. So instead, think about if the learner was to learn these 3 or 4 chords, the 20%, to play hundreds and hundreds of popular songs. Well, then they can play the song, and these early wins are very important because they increase enthusiasm and your confidence. So you're likely to stick with it. This is the minimal effective dose. And then the last S is stakes. Not the kind you eat, but think about like a bet or a wager. Numerous studies published by psychologists have found that people are more motivated by losing something than by winning something. You're more likely to be motivated by losing $100 than winning $100. So when learning something new, think about someone close to you. Confide in them, or maybe they have the same goal and you can set up a wager. In 3 months, whoever runs the fastest 5K gets dinner bought for them, maybe more. The bigger the stake, the more likely you are to excel. $100, $200. So that was DIS, deconstruct, select, sequence, and stakes. Let's move on to the last method, CAFE, CFE. Now, CFE, you can remember it by CAFE, simply stands for compression, frequency, and encoding. So with compression, it's about simplifying all the information, maybe putting it into a one-pager. Simplification can be symbolized as mastery of a subject. So let's go back to cooking. Think about if you could put all the different ways of cooking something, your favorite sauces, pairings, and seasoning all on one sheet of paper to reference to. This will get ingrained in your memory to where you won't even have to look at it anymore. The next letter, F, is for frequency. How often do I have to work on this or study it, and how much time? Well, that depends on your goal. So if we were to take learning to speak Spanish versus computer programming, well, to learn to speak Spanish, let's say your goal is a year, maybe it just takes 5 to 10 minutes a day, a few times a week for that year. But let's say you're trying to learn to program computers in 3 months and become world class at it. This could take 2 hours a day, 5 days a week for the whole 3 months. Now the last one is encoding. And this is a lot easier than it sounds. We use encoding every day. It simply means taking old information and using it to remember new information. Examples of this are we use acronyms, mnemonic devices, and little songs. We've used these since we were little kids. Think about lefty loosey, righty tighty, and then even think about this method, CFE, CAFE, easy to remember. Oftentimes we think of smart people hanging out at cafes. So that was CFE, CAFE, and it might seem a little more advanced, but it can definitely aid you and facilitate the process of becoming world class at something. So to end, I would just like to review these methods with you. So the first one, the 7 sensory loops, taking it in and putting it back out there 7 times. DIS, deconstruct, select, sequence, and stakes. And then CAFE, CFE, compress, frequency, the minimal effective dose, and then encode. Maybe before you thought it was impossible to become world class at something, be in the top 5%. But now it's easier and faster than you could have imagined. This is all through the superpower of meta learning. I'd like to end you with one more tip from Olympic gold